So I'm finally back after an admittedly longer layoff than I was planning on having after E3. I was a little torn on what I wanted to talk about for my first video back, and the topics for a while largely came down to the influence, for better or worse, of celebrity players stepping into the fighting game community. I'm all for it under the right circumstances. Or the prospects of the new Sonic the Hedgehog titles being any good. They're certainly drawing from the right influences. Still, I didn't quite have enough to say about either to justify dedicating entire videos to the topics. Today, though, I'd like to speak on genres. Normally, when we talk about words having power, we're speaking on a more profound societal level, but you'll have to forgive me for being a little less profound here. During E3 this year, I had a few conversations with my Smashpad colleagues about how Horizon Zero Dawn and The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild look remarkably similar, almost like direct competitors at this point. This observation was met with mixed responses for the most part, which made me wonder how in the world others weren't seeing what I was seeing. I was ultimately vindicated when Sony's Shuhei Yoshida made the same comparison in an interview, so I wasn't just going crazy. Sure, the objects of the respective games might be somewhat different, but you're going about it in entirely the same way, and isn't that what it all comes down to? How you're doing things more than what you're doing? This is more of an issue with racing games, because arcade racing has unfortunately come to mean anything that isn't a simulation. You have players thinking that arcade racing is really alive and well, when it has in fact been entirely dragged under by a very different beast. Thanks to Ivory Tower developers during an E3 2015 stage interview, I believe with GameSpot, we now have action racing as a term we can apply to that very different beast. This would describe Ivory Tower's own offering, The Crew, as well as most Need for Speed installments of late, the Burnout series, and lesser-known 7th Gen offering Split Second, among others. The reason it's important to adopt the action racing tag is because it shines a spotlight on the fact that arcade racing, genuine arcade racing, pick up and play but still difficult to master, well standardized, devoid of disruptive elements like dynamic courses or ambient traffic, and generally unencumbered by the usual trappings of modern console gaming, is certainly not alive and well. Ridge Racer sat out an entire generation of console launches, which is utterly unheard of for that series since its inception, and was last seen trying to sell out to the action racing side of things with Ridge Racers Unbounded and Driftopia. Sega, once the undisputed king of the arcade racer, hasn't released a Hang-On, Outrun, Sega Rally, or Daytona game in years. This leaves it up to independent developers like Super Systems to fill in the void with games like their upcoming Drift stage, which looks great, but while they're doing a great job, it's still far too much of a load to carry to leave it entirely up to indie teams. Hopefully this situation improves in the coming years as awareness increases of the underserved audience. Shall we get a little more divisive now? Certainly the fighting genre existed before the arrival of Street Fighter II. No one is really wanting for examples of fighting games that come from the 1980s before Akira Nishitani and Yoshiki Okamoto altered the gaming landscape with their breakthrough offering, but it was certainly Street Fighter II that necessitated the label of fighting games. Playing back then, you knew a revolution was underway, and it was quite separate from something like the NES version of Double Dragon in two-player versus mode, or other beat-em-ups like Battletoads with friendly fire enabled. What really made fighting games possible was one simple but defining mechanic. All player actions are dependent on the relative placement of the other player. If you push the stick in the opposite direction from your opponent, your character backs up rather than turning around and walking away. In most cases, this also activates the game's defensive state. This means that by design, fighting games are really built around a one-on-one mechanic. There have been cases where expansion has been attempted, but it always comes out awkward and kind of broken because it's always possible that the targeting will get thrown off. When games are built around such an attempt, you get hot garbage, such as we saw with Guilty Gear Isuka years ago. It's probably kind of obvious where I'm going with this now. Now let me start off by saying that I love the Super Smash Bros. Series. Melee is one of the first Perfect Tens I've ever handed out as a game reviewer, alongside Shenmue and Grandia. But when I reviewed it, fighting games never once entered into my mind. I was playing a 2D platformer with different objectives the entire time, so imagine my surprise a couple years down the road when a bunch of Nintendo fans used the game's wealth of options to try and cobble it into something vaguely resembling a fighting game, and insisting it be included in major fighting game events. Now, even though they've long since gotten what they wanted, it still makes no sense to me. Or to series producer Masahiro Sakurai, it should be noted. This is a double-edged sword. Not only is Smash crowding out born-and-bred fighting games that deserve to appear at major events, the Smash community's unwillingness to branch off into its own thing is also detrimental to games like PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale, Onimusha Blade Warriors, and most costly of all, Power Stone and Power Stone 2. There's an entire other scene that could be cultivated here, and it's going to waste because the Smash community insists on being dependent on the fighting game community's events, labeling its own titles as fighting games, when its very own worthy standard bearer could be the game for a whole new crowd of gamers to rally around. Well, that's certainly more ground than I planned on covering in just one video, but it's good to be back. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and feel free to let me know if you have any topics you'd like me to address in the future. Until next time.